The first thing you need to understand is that Buckingham Palace doesn't panic. The royal family, with all its stiff upper lips and centuries of protocol, doesn't scream, doesn't yell, and certainly doesn't panic, which is exactly what made this particular morning so shocking. The gates of the Montecito mansion hadn't even warmed under the California sun before Meghan Markle was seen racing out of her front door, barefoot, clutching her phone in one hand and a crumpled white envelope in the other. The look on her face, raw, disoriented, pale, was not one of a woman used to losing control. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This wasn't the everyday tabloid commotion, the kind of drama stirred up by headlines or gossip columnists. No, this was something far more dangerous. This was something that came from the highest level of royalty, from beyond the grave, and it was real. In her hand, the letter, sealed in red wax. A royal crest pressed into the envelope. What was inside? Words written by none other than Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh. Words that, for all intents and purposes, obliterated the royal titles of her children. Not just questioned them, not challenged them, stripped them, erased them, ghosted them, as if they had never been born into the line of succession. As if Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana had never existed at all. Now let's rewind. Because to understand the firestorm that led to that scream, to that panic, you have to go back. You have to know the history that made this possible, and the deep resentments that had festered between Meghan Markle and the House of Windsor from the very beginning. You have to examine the strange silence around the births of her children, the conflicting records, the missing hospital photos, the whispered theories that began as fringe conspiracies and eventually crept into hushed drawing rooms and court corridors. You have to understand why Prince Philip, a man known for his discipline, his sharp tongue, and his unshakable loyalty to the crown, felt compelled to write such a letter in the first place, and why it was hidden from public view for so long. This story doesn't begin with the letter. It begins with a decision made behind the heavy doors of Balmoral Castle, months before the world would ever know that Meghan and Harry were stepping down as senior royals. It was during one of those infamous Sunday lunches, where the family met not as celebrities but as custodians of the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth at the head, Prince Philip by her side, and the next three kings in line all seated nearby. The topic that day? Legitimacy. Future heirs. The preservation of the crown's image. Meghan wasn't there, but she was most definitely the subject. Prince Philip, who had always been wary of outsiders, reportedly voiced a growing concern that no one else in the room dared to articulate out loud. What do we really know about the children? Had due diligence been performed? Were these children truly born of royal blood? Had the family rushed to extend courtesy titles without verifying lineage? These weren't just the ramblings of an old man. They were fears grounded in what he believed were patterns of manipulation, deceit, and control. The monarchy had been burned before. By scandal, by abdication, by disobedience. Philip had lived long enough to see it all. He knew what it looked like when a single individual tried to reshape the monarchy around their own image. And to him, Meghan was doing just that. Rewriting royal expectations, setting her own rules, and dragging his grandson into a world of branding, TV deals, and publicity stunts. When the letter was penned, it was never meant to be public. That's key. This wasn't a press release. It wasn't something drafted with palace PR advisors. It was handwritten, personal, confidential, meant to be opened only upon a certain condition. Should the monarchy ever reach a critical turning point with Harry and Meghan's conduct, the letter would serve as both evidence and instruction, a safeguard for the institution. And that moment came faster than anyone had predicted. But how did that letter, sealed and buried within royal archives, end up in Meghan Markle's trembling hand? The answer lies in a single event. A security breach so minor at the time, it barely registered in the mainstream press. A data leak inside the royal mailroom. An intern, new to the job, mistakenly misfiled a series of documents slated for internal review. A few envelopes, including Philip's letter, ended up among outgoing correspondence. By the time the mistake was realized, it was too late. One of those letters was already on a flight bound for Los Angeles. When Meghan opened the envelope, expecting perhaps a belated note or something ceremonial in tone, what she found instead was nothing short of character assassination. Philip's language was brutal, direct, regal. He didn't accuse her of a crime. He didn't scream or insult. He simply laid out a meticulous case, bullet by bullet, about why Archie and Lilibet could not, and should not, ever be granted royal status. The letter stated clearly that any titles they might have received were done so prematurely and without proper vetting. More damningly, it included private memos, references to meetings, to royal aides who had quietly expressed unease, and even to a suggested paternity verification request that Meghan had allegedly denied. The tone of the letter was not a suggestion. It was a revocation. It was, in effect, a royal deletion. From Meghan's perspective, it wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war. If the contents of that letter were made public, they wouldn't just impact her children. They would unravel everything. Her brand, her status, her place in the history books. Because, as she saw it, titles were not just symbolic, they were foundational. They were the golden thread that tied her to something permanent, something more powerful than Hollywood. And this is why she screamed. Because it wasn't just the letter. It was the implication that the narrative she'd fought to create was no longer under her control. That the British monarchy, through the cold, posthumous voice of Prince Philip, was reclaiming its authority, and doing it in a way that couldn't be publicly challenged without revealing far more than she wanted the world to see. What followed over the next few hours were frantic phone calls. Meghan to Harry, Harry to Charles, Charles to private advisors. And silence. Deafening silence. Not one reply. Not a single answer. And that silence, more than anything else, told her what she needed to know. The family wasn't denying the letter. They weren't refuting it. They were letting it breathe. The question now is what Meghan would do with it. Would she go public? Would she sue? Would she finally provide the documentation she'd so long resisted sharing? Or would she vanish, quietly, hoping that the story would dissolve in a flurry of headlines and distractions? This story, this moment, is the pivot point. Not just for Meghan and Harry, but for the monarchy itself. For decades, the British royal family has battled scandal, rebellion, divorce, death, and disgrace. But never before has it had to confront the possibility that its bloodline, its literal future, might have been tainted, falsified, or fabricated. As the letter circulates behind the scenes, questions multiply like wildfire. Is there more than one letter? Were others written by Queen Elizabeth herself? What secrets remain sealed, waiting to be unearthed? And most haunting of all, if Archie and Lilibet were never real royals to begin with, what does that make Meghan? This is where we begin. There is something haunting about the way stories twist over time, how what starts as a celebration can quietly transform into controversy. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle announced the birth of their first child, Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, the world paused. There was curiosity, adoration, and of course, a tidal wave of media coverage. But even in that moment of joy, cracks had already begun to show. The British royal family follows tradition with almost religious discipline. Births, christenings, the naming of heirs, each step is cloaked in formality. There are photo calls on the hospital steps, a presentation to the Queen, public birth announcements, and a flurry of public records. But in the case of Archie, the usual rhythm was disrupted. There was no immediate hospital presentation. The first photographs were vague and limited. Even the announcement felt muted, as if something was being held back. Behind closed doors, palace aides were reportedly confused. Questions were raised, albeit in whispers. Where exactly was Archie born? Why was the name not immediately entered into the traditional court circular? And why were certain standard documents, like birth certifications, slow to surface? These weren't conspiracy theories at the time. They were simply concerns, flagged internally, never brought to the press. But it didn't stop there. In the months following Archie's birth, royal observers and experts noted another deviation, the absence of a title. Given his lineage, Archie was entitled to be called Earl of Dumbarton, a courtesy title available through Harry. But Harry and Meghan announced they would forego all titles for their son. They claimed it was to give him a more normal life, to spare him the burden of formality. To many, this seemed noble. But to royal historians, it was puzzling. No title? No hospital debut? Limited records? It was unlike any royal birth in recent memory. Some began to whisper that perhaps the choice to avoid a title wasn't entirely theirs to make. Perhaps something had been decided internally. Perhaps someone high up had quietly suggested it was best for now, until all questions were answered. That someone, many believe, was Prince Philip. The late Duke of Edinburgh had long served as the monarchy's internal compass. Though not always in the spotlight, he was regarded as a strategist, a protector of legacy. And sources close to the palace claimed that Philip had been particularly vocal during Meghan's pregnancy. Not about her health or happiness, but about documentation. He reportedly questioned whether all required protocols were being followed, whether Meghan was sharing everything the palace needed to confirm the legitimacy of the birth and future titles. Why was this such a big deal? Because the titles bestowed on royal children are not simply ornamental. They are statements of succession, indicators of proximity to the crown. They open doors to security protection, to royal funding, to ceremonial roles that are passed through generations. To allow someone to hold such a title without complete verification would be, in the eyes of a traditionalist like Philip, a dereliction of duty. And then came Lilibet Diana. The announcement of Meghan and Harry's second child, this time a daughter, was even more peculiar. She was born in California, thousands of miles from the palace. The royal family was reportedly informed only after the media had already received the press release. Again, no title. Again, very little documentation made public. This time, however, the name Lilibet raised eyebrows. That name wasn't just symbolic. It was sacred. Lilibet was Queen Elizabeth II's private family nickname, used by only a select few throughout her life. Philip, Charles, and a handful of royal intimates. For Meghan and Harry to use it, without the Queen's visible consent, was viewed by insiders as a brazen move. Some even called it an insult. Philip, by this time, was nearing the end of his life, but he reportedly responded to the name choice with fury. Privately, he saw it as Meghan planting herself at the heart of the monarchy's legacy. Naming a child after the Queen's inner circle moniker, while living in exile, while criticizing the crown in interviews, was seen by Philip as the ultimate manipulation. By the time Philip died, tensions were boiling beneath the surface. Meghan and Harry had accused the royal family of racism in a bombshell interview with Oprah Winfrey. They'd stepped down from official duties, and they had begun launching commercial ventures under their personal brand. But Philip hadn't just been watching from a distance. He'd been writing, making records, crafting letters that were to be held in the strictest confidence. Letters that addressed what he believed to be the greatest threat to the monarchy's continuity. The issue of the children's legitimacy. Though the public was unaware, Philip had been working with royal legal advisors to assess what protocols had been broken. He wanted clear documentation on the children's births and on the process by which they were or were not granted titles. When those documents were incomplete or inaccessible, his suspicions deepened. What had started as a quiet concern was now a full-blown internal inquiry. Confidential memos were exchanged. Aides were instructed to gather files, review media records, and submit their findings to a sealed document. This would become the foundation of what is now referred to as the ghost title file. The contents of that file, now believed to be attached to Philip's sealed letter, were scathing. They did not accuse Meghan and Harry of criminal wrongdoing, but they did document a pattern of omissions, evasions, and non-cooperation that suggested the crown had been misled. The word revocation appeared multiple times, not as punishment, but as correction, a formal annulment of any unofficial recognition of the children's status within the royal framework. To those inside the palace who read it, the implications were clear. Archie and Lilibet were not to be counted in the official royal line, not until full verification could be obtained, not until the doubts could be erased. And if that verification never came, neither would the titles. This secret would remain buried for months. Until, of course, the letter slipped through the cracks. But long before that dramatic morning in Montecito, before Meghan's scream echoed down her gated driveway, the foundation for this unraveling had already been laid. Not by scandalous headlines or opportunistic journalists, but by a deep, methodical concern about lineage. A fear that the monarchy had been infiltrated not by an outsider, but by uncertainty. That is the origin of the ghost title scandal. Of all the traditions the royal family holds dear, documentation is among the most sacred. Every royal birth, death, and marriage is recorded with a precision that borders on obsessive. The lineage of the House of Windsor isn't just remembered, it's archived, stamped, sealed, and filed away in thick leather-bound volumes going back centuries. There is a reason for this level of scrutiny. The British monarchy doesn't just operate on legacy, it survives by proving that legacy without question. Which is why the birth certificates of Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana caused a stir from the moment they were released, if you could call it that. Let's start with Archie. Born on May 6, 2019, his birth was announced via a carefully worded Instagram post from the Sussex royal account. The tone was friendly and informal, breaking away from the official statements the royal family typically provides. What followed was even more unusual. There was no hospital step photo op, no presentation of the newborn to the media. Royal watchers waited and waited. When the birth certificate finally appeared weeks later, it was filled with subtle yet significant oddities. The most obvious issue? The location. Instead of the expected St. Mary's Hospital in London, where Kate Middleton had given birth to all three of her children, Meghan delivered Archie at the Portland Hospital, a private clinic known more for celebrities than royal tradition. That fact alone wasn't inherently suspicious. Other royals have chosen private care, but the way it was handled raised eyebrows. There was no media presence at the hospital, no timing confirmation, no footage of the Sussexes arriving or leaving. Then came the issue of Meghan's name on the certificate. Initially, the document listed her full name as Rachel Meghan Markle. Later, in a quiet amendment that was neither explained nor announced, her name was changed to Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. The first version of the certificate had been registered on May 17th. By June 5th, the new version appeared, without fanfare. Royal biographers, journalists, and curious citizens began asking questions. Why the change? Who requested it? Was it a personal choice or a palace directive? Buckingham Palace remained silent. Meghan and Harry, in a rare move, issued a public statement denying that they were behind the alteration, suggesting that the palace had changed the document without their consent. This led to speculation that a power struggle was unfolding behind the scenes, one that centered around control, identity, and legacy. Why would the palace want to remove Meghan's given name and leave only her title? Was it a clerical correction or something more strategic? The inconsistencies didn't stop there. Several journalists noted that key details typically found on royal birth certificates were either missing or vague. The time of birth, for example, was oddly delayed in being published. Normally, this information is included in the announcement or released soon after. With Archie, it trickled out days later. Additionally, the midwife's information and attending physician's credentials were not confirmed by the palace, as is custom. If this were anyone else, it might have gone unnoticed. But this was the birth of a child seventh in line to the throne. Every detail mattered. Now fast forward to June 4th, 2021, the birth of Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor. This time, the birth occurred in Santa Barbara, California, at the Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital. Once again, the birth was announced not by Buckingham Palace, but by the Sussexes press team. And again, there were no photographs, no medical staff confirmations, no visual proof of the hospital setting. Just a short statement and a name, Lilibet Diana, a name that would ignite controversy. Within days, royal insiders were leaking quiet frustrations to the press. According to reports, Queen Elizabeth had not been consulted prior to the name being chosen. Harry and Meghan claimed she had been informed, even approved the decision. The palace, in a rare act of contradiction, denied that such approval had been given. This back and forth was more than a family squabble. It was a constitutional issue. To name a child after the reigning monarch without consent was, to some, a breach of etiquette. To others, it was a provocation. And then came the paperwork. Lilibet's birth certificate, when it finally surfaced, showed Harry listed as the Duke of Sussex, while Meghan was recorded as Rachel Meghan Markle. This was a reversal from Archie's certificate, which now listed her solely by title. Why the inconsistency? Why revert to her given name after removing it from the previous document? Legal analysts and former royal clerks weighed in, stating that the use of titles versus birth names should follow a consistent standard, especially in documents linked to the monarchy. But it wasn't just about titles. The address listed on the certificate was vague. The medical professional who signed off on the birth was not a name familiar in royal circles. And, perhaps most strikingly, the certificate was issued without any visual confirmation of the child's existence. This is where the theories began to multiply. A number of former palace staff and observers began raising quiet, careful questions. Why had no one in the royal household seen either child in person since their births? Why had no senior royal, including the Queen, Charles, or William, physically met Archie or Lilibet? Why were there no family portraits, no royal introductions, no photos beyond the occasional carefully curated image released through Sussex-controlled channels? A former royal security officer, speaking anonymously, disclosed that during Harry and Meghan's last official visit to the UK, no arrangements were made for the children to meet with their British family. None. Not even behind closed doors. Requests were made, he said, but denied or ignored. Then came the questions of legitimacy. Legal experts began pointing out that without verified birth records from an approved royal facility, and without eyewitness or formal witness statements from official palace representatives, the line of succession might be challenged. Not officially, not yet, but quietly. In a family where paperwork is law and tradition is gospel, these certificates did not meet the unspoken but well-established standards. And this, sources suggest, is when Prince Philip stepped in. He began compiling notes, letters, documents, records from previous royal births. He began building a case not based on accusation, but on procedure. Had the proper steps been followed? Were the right officials informed? Were the documents reviewed and confirmed by the Crown's legal advisors? The answer, again and again, seemed to be no. What emerged from this scrutiny was not a tabloid theory, but a quiet movement inside the palace to re-examine the status of these children within the royal structure. Not because of who they were, but because of what had been left incomplete. And that incompleteness, that lack of transparency, opened the door to something far more damning: the possibility that the children's titles had been assumed, not earned. As the months went by, those inside the royal household knew that a reckoning was coming. The documents didn't lie, but they also didn't tell the full truth. And that half-truth was beginning to wear on the institution's credibility. Prince Philip's letter, as it turned out, was less about emotion and more about enforcement. He didn't call Meghan a liar. He didn't accuse Harry of wrongdoing. He simply pointed to the documents, or lack thereof, and made a judgment. Without proper confirmation, the titles could not stand. And so, a single piece of parchment, signed by a dying royal consort, took aim at two of the most publicly discussed children in modern royal history. All because of paperwork, or the absence of it. It's a strange thing, reading the words of a man who's no longer alive. Stranger still when those words have the power to reshape the future of one of the world's oldest institutions. But that's exactly what happened when a sealed letter, written in the precise hand of Prince Philip, surfaced in the most unexpected way. This wasn't a farewell note or a loving message to his great-grandchildren. It was a formal document, an artifact of quiet fury, a final act of guardianship from a man who had spent over 70 years standing just behind the British throne. The existence of the letter was never meant to be public knowledge. In fact, its very purpose hinged on its secrecy. According to insiders, Prince Philip had drafted the document in early 2021, shortly after Meghan and Harry's interview with Oprah sent shockwaves across the globe. For a man like Philip, who had dedicated his life to the survival of the monarchy, that interview wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. At 99, Philip had seen the monarchy tested in ways no one else alive had. He had survived the abdication crisis, the Diana scandal, the explosive Andrew controversies, and the slow erosion of the British Empire. He knew that the one thing keeping the monarchy intact was its ability to control its own narrative. And suddenly, Harry and Meghan were writing a completely different story. The letter wasn't written in anger. Not exactly. It was written in response to what Philip believed was a calculated threat to the institution he had defended for nearly a century. The threat wasn't the interview itself. It was what he saw as the manipulation of legacy. And more precisely, the manipulation of lineage. According to those who've seen the contents, the letter began with a tone of measured concern. Philip referenced the tradition of royal documentation, the importance of transparency, and the sacred nature of bloodline verification. He didn't accuse Meghan and Harry of outright deceit. He posed questions, pointed, specific questions. He asked why standard documentation had not been reviewed by the Royal Legal Office. He noted that no senior royal had physically verified the presence of either child. He pointed to the changing details on birth certificates and the absence of established protocols. Then he went further. He wrote that unless these discrepancies were resolved to the satisfaction of the Crown, the children of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were not to be recognized as holding royal titles or positions in the line of succession. His wording was firm but exact. Not banished. Not disinherited. Simply unrecognized. Their presence in the royal family, he wrote, must be treated as symbolic unless and until clarity is restored. There were no grand accusations. No name-calling. Just facts. Dates. Missing information. Quotes from private discussions. Even copies of letters and emails from palace staff expressing unease with how the births had been handled. Philip was building a legal case, not a personal attack. But make no mistake, this was a bombshell. He signed the letter in full, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Beneath the signature was a secondary instruction. His private secretary was to deliver the document to the Lord Chamberlain upon his death. It was not to be shared with Charles or the Queen immediately. It was to be reviewed by the constitutional advisors first, in private. Yet, somehow, the letter didn't stay hidden. A leak occurred within the Royal Mail Service. Some reports claim it was a clerical error, a misfiled batch of documents that ended up in a dispatch meant for public records. Others believe it was deliberate, that someone inside the palace, perhaps loyal to Harry or Meghan, discovered the letter and sent it directly to them in California. Whatever the case, Meghan received it. And the moment she read it, everything changed. Her reaction was not controlled. It wasn't part of a media strategy or carefully worded press release. It was visceral, emotional. Witnesses later described her as pale, disoriented, and visibly shaken, not because she had been insulted, but because the rug had been pulled from under her entire narrative. This wasn't just about Archie and Lilibet's titles. It was about the future she had crafted, the foundation of her public identity. And now, a single letter was threatening to burn it all down. Meghan wasn't the only one blindsided. Prince Harry, upon learning about the letter, reportedly demanded a private call with his father. That call, according to sources, was not granted. Charles had already been informed about the document through his own advisors, and rather than deny its contents, he chose silence. The Queen, too, was aware. Though aged and grieving the loss of her husband, she reportedly read the letter in full and said nothing. She didn't object. She didn't dispute its claims. And that silence spoke louder than any denial. Behind palace walls, discussions began immediately. What was the legal standing of Philip's letter? Could it be enforced? Did it hold weight beyond the grave? Royal legal scholars were divided. Some believed the letter, while powerful, was merely advisory, a respected opinion from a senior royal. Others saw it differently. They argued that because the letter was addressed to constitutional officers and included corroborating documents, it amounted to a formal directive. At the very least, it provided grounds to re-examine the children's titles. This wasn't just about Meghan and Harry anymore. It was about precedent. If Archie and Lilibet were allowed to retain their status in spite of Philip's letter, it could open the door for any member of the royal family to bypass tradition in the future. And that, to the establishment, was a risk too great to ignore. The letter's existence also reignited internal divisions. Prince William reportedly supported a thorough review, agreeing that royal lineage should never be taken for granted. He is said to have told aides, "If we don't protect the line now, we're rewriting history with feelings, not facts." Camilla, ever the traditionalist, stood by the letter's intent. And while Charles refrained from making any public moves, insiders say he quietly instructed the legal team to begin exploring options. But not everyone was in agreement. Some staffers felt the letter was cruel, that it targeted Meghan unfairly and risked alienating younger generations. Others feared the public fallout. How would the British people react to the monarchy questioning the legitimacy of two small children? Still, the document had been written. It existed. And once revealed, it could not be undone. In California, the mood shifted quickly. Meghan's camp issued no formal statement. Harry remained silent. But behind the scenes, lawyers were consulted. Meetings were held. Rumors swirled that Meghan considered releasing her own version of the letter, one that framed it as an attack on her children, a racist gesture from an out-of-touch institution. But even her closest advisors knew that such a move could backfire. The letter, as cold as it wasn't emotional. It wasn't hateful. It was logical, legal. And those types of attacks are the hardest to spin. So the letter remained in the shadows of public consciousness, acknowledged by some, denied by others. But within the royal halls, its weight was undeniable. A ticking clock had begun. A reckoning that Philip, even in death, had set in motion. This was not a letter designed to destroy. It was designed to protect. In Philip's mind, the monarchy could not survive ambiguity. Titles could not be based on sentiment. And if any doubt remained, it had to be removed, even if that meant undoing everything Meghan and Harry had built. By the time the letter had reached Meghan Markle's hands, the royal machinery was already in motion. But what most people don't realize is that the document had been known to palace officials long before its unintentional, or perhaps intentional, release. The letter wasn't misplaced in the post or dropped by accident into a California-bound envelope. That was the story told publicly to save face. But the truth, as it emerged from whispered conversations among former staff and buried memos, was far more calculated. The letter had been read, discussed, and debated at the highest levels of the monarchy. And then it was buried. Suppression is not a word typically associated with Buckingham Palace. The royal family operates under a rigid structure of discretion, where issues are either ignored or handled quietly. But suppression? That requires intent. And intent was exactly what came into question as more insiders began revealing the extent to which this letter had been deliberately concealed. According to sources close to the palace administration, Prince Philip's letter was received by the Lord Chamberlain's office within days of his death in April 2021. It was catalogued, logged, and filed as part of his final estate of private correspondence. The contents, as we now know, were incendiary. But at the time, only a small circle of trusted individuals had access to it. Among them were senior constitutional advisors, the Queen's private secretary, and Charles himself. The letter, by all official standards, should have prompted immediate action. Its claims were specific, its implications serious. A senior royal had effectively challenged the legitimacy of 2 children in the line of succession. But rather than trigger an inquiry or prompt a review of royal records, the letter was shelved. Locked away in a private archive with a classification code that effectively made it invisible to all but a handful of people. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. One former aide, speaking under condition of anonymity, described the meeting where the decision was made. According to this individual, Charles and his most trusted legal advisor sat with the document in hand. They debated whether opening this particular door would do more damage than good. The fear wasn't that Philip's claims would be proven false. The fear was that they might be proven true, and that the public would never forgive the institution for allowing such a scandal to unfold in silence for so long. Another key factor was timing. The letter had arrived just as the monarchy was grappling with a wave of public scrutiny. Prince Andrew's legal battles were dominating headlines. Meghan and Harry's interview with Oprah had turned global sentiment against the firm. The Queen was mourning the death of her husband. Opening a new investigation into the legitimacy of her great-grandchildren, especially during such a delicate time, was unthinkable. So the letter was silenced. In palace terminology, this is known as containment. Not destruction. Not denial. Just a quiet agreement that something too dangerous to address is best left unacknowledged. They believed that as long as the document remained buried, the issue would fade into the background. Meghan and Harry were already thousands of miles away. Public focus would shift. The monarchy would move forward. But they underestimated one thing: the desperation within Meghan's world to remain connected to the royal structure. It's no secret that the Sussexes' brand, from the very beginning, has leaned heavily on their royal identity. Their titles, their lineage, their association with the Queen, all have been central to their business ventures, media presence, and public appeal. A letter that questioned the foundation of their children's connection to the crown wasn't just a personal attack. It was a financial threat. And the longer the palace tried to contain it, the more dangerous the potential leak became. Which brings us to the moment everything unraveled. Insiders say it wasn't a palace clerk or disgruntled aide who leaked the letter. It was someone much closer to the inner circle. A person who, though loyal to the crown, felt that the decision to suppress such a vital document violated the public's right to know the truth. That individual allegedly copied the letter, removed the original from the restricted file temporarily, and forwarded a digital copy to an anonymous third party, one with direct ties to Meghan's legal team. Within 48 hours, Meghan had the letter. From that point forward, suppression was no longer an option. But the palace didn't know that yet. As far as they were concerned, the document was still safely locked away. They believed their silence had worked. They thought the storm had passed. Then came the call. The Queen's private secretary received a message from one of Harry's legal representatives requesting a formal audience regarding a critical matter of succession protocol. It was the kind of language that suggested urgency. The kind of language that only gets used when someone wants to push a confrontation. The palace scrambled. It took them almost a full day to realize what had happened. By then, Meghan's team had already contacted several international media outlets, shopping the story and preparing legal strategies in case the palace responded publicly. But here's where things get murky. Despite the magnitude of the situation, no official statement was made by Buckingham Palace. Not then, not weeks later. They neither confirmed nor denied the existence of the letter. The Queen, still grieving, remained silent. Charles refused all media inquiries. William declined to comment. The entire family fell back on their age-old tactic. Never complain, never explain. Behind the scenes, however, the pressure was building. Legal teams began drafting emergency statements. Crisis PR consultants were brought in. Advisors debated whether to preempt the leak by acknowledging the letter in their own terms. But every scenario led to the same dilemma. Admitting the truth would force a broader review of Meghan and Harry's claims, potentially opening old wounds and triggering investigations into how titles were handled internally. So, the suppression continued. Not of the document itself. By now, it was already out there, but of acknowledgement. The palace chose a strategy of calculated indifference, hoping the story would fade or be discredited as another tabloid fantasy. But it didn't fade. In fact, the more they avoided addressing it, the more credible it became. Reporters dug deeper. Legal experts began asking why no one had refuted the letter's content. Public opinion, once sympathetic to the Queen, started to fracture. If there was nothing to hide, why the silence? And still, Meghan said nothing. Her silence, too, was strategic. She was waiting, watching, letting the palace twist in its own knots while preparing her next move. Whether that move would be legal action, a public interview, or a leaked recording, no one knew. But one thing was clear. The letter was no longer a private matter. It was a ticking bomb sitting in the center of a very public stage. What makes this moment in the royal saga so unusual is the absence of control. The monarchy, for all its rigid formality, had lost the narrative. A letter written by a man no longer alive had more power than the words of the reigning king. The institution that had survived wars, abdications, divorces, and scandal after scandal was now paralyzed by a single piece of paper and its silent aftermath. And the question remained, why not come clean? Why not release the letter and address its contents head-on? The answer, as many believe, lies in the nature of the claims. The letter didn't just raise questions. It documented specific moments where Meghan and Harry allegedly declined to provide the crown with proof of birth details. It included references to correspondence where Meghan refused DNA confirmation for lineage registry. It hinted at meetings where aides voiced doubts and were dismissed. To release the letter would mean exposing those actions, not just as oversights, but as deliberate choices. And if those choices were made with intent, the implications would be devastating. So, the suppression continued. Quiet, careful, and crumbling. For months, the letter remained a ghost in the room, spoken about in private, hinted at in tabloid columns, dissected in YouTube videos and online forums. But while the official royal channels kept to their time-tested strategy of silence, the walls around them slowly began to crack. One by one, people who had worked behind the scenes during those turbulent years started to talk. Former aides, nannies, drivers, legal assistants, individuals who had signed strict non-disclosure agreements, but were no longer willing to hold their tongues. The letter had stirred something deeper, something heavier than gossip. It raised questions of truth, and more importantly, of accountability. The first person to speak was a woman named Teresa M., who had worked as a night staffer at the royal residence in Windsor. She didn't give a press interview. She didn't go live on a talk show. She sent an anonymous handwritten letter to a journalist who had previously reported on the Sussexes' departure. In the note, she described being present on the night when Prince Philip reportedly summoned his private secretary and two senior advisors for what she called an urgent family matter. According to her, Philip was unusually tense that evening. Not angry, but focused. He dismissed all staff early, a rare move for the highly disciplined Duke. No one was allowed near the drawing room where the meeting took place. And when she tried to clean the adjoining hallway the next morning, she was told to return in an hour. Her letter may have been vague, but it was enough to confirm that something significant had taken place, something outside the ordinary rhythms of royal life. The journalist cross-referenced her claim with the internal visitor logs from that night. Two of the names she mentioned did, in fact, enter Windsor Castle at the time she indicated. Soon after that letter was published in a limited report, more sources came forward. A former staff member at Buckingham Palace, who asked to be identified only as Richard, gave a quiet but explosive interview to an independent royal historian. Richard had served in the administrative department that handled archival materials and internal communications. According to him, the existence of Prince Philip's letter was known among at least a dozen senior staffers within 3 days of the Duke's passing. The letter had been registered, catalogued, and flagged for internal review. But what stood out most in Richard's testimony was this. The letter had been marked with a red classification stamp, reserved only for materials that required legal discretion. He explained that such a stamp was used only in situations involving constitutional implications. This wasn't just family drama. The letter, he claimed, had been treated from the start as a legal threat, not just a private concern. That detail added a new layer of urgency to the narrative. If the palace had considered it legally significant, why had it been ignored publicly for so long? Another voice entered the conversation weeks later. This time, it came from California. A former housekeeper who had worked at the Montecito residence under contract for 4 months provided her account to a tabloid that, up until then, had shown little interest in covering the scandal. Her name was Maria, and she claimed to have been present on the very day Meghan received the letter. She recalled chaos that morning. Meghan, she said, had been in a good mood until an envelope arrived via private courier. Within 20 minutes, everything changed. Meghan reportedly locked herself in the bedroom and began making calls. Loud, agitated calls. The house's usual hum of calm was replaced by slamming doors and rapid footsteps. Later that evening, Maria said she overheard Meghan shouting at Harry in their home office. The phrase she remembered most clearly was, "They're trying to erase them." She didn't know what it meant at the time. But days later, Meghan allegedly fired 2 part-time staffers, changed her security schedule, and canceled all upcoming public appearances. The anecdote could have been dismissed as idle chatter, but another source supported her story. A private driver, employed by a luxury car service contracted by the Sussexes, confirmed that he was instructed to take a sealed envelope from the Montecito residence to a private attorney's office in Los Angeles just 2 days after the alleged meltdown. The driver didn't know what was inside, but the urgency with which he was contacted and the secrecy around the delivery stood out in his memory. Each of these individuals painted part of a larger picture. A mosaic of private alarm, suppressed communication, and behind-the-scenes panic that stood in stark contrast to the calm, polished image the Sussexes projected publicly. But perhaps the most damning revelation came from someone within the royal household itself. A retired aide, now living abroad, broke her silence through an interview with a European newspaper. Identified only as Eleanor, she had served in the royal communications team for over a decade. She claimed to have read Prince Philip's letter in its original form. She described it as brief but unflinching. In her words, Philip had written the document not to embarrass anyone, but to shield the monarchy from future crisis. Eleanor confirmed that the letter included a list of discrepancies, missing documents, withheld confirmations, and internal memos that had been flagged during the pregnancies of both Archie and Lilibet. When asked why the palace never acknowledged the letter, Eleanor was quiet. Then she said something chilling, because it would mean admitting the institution failed to enforce its own laws, and because it would prove the children's titles were granted under false assumptions. As more witnesses spoke, a pattern emerged. A pattern of avoidance, of carefully coordinated silence that extended across continents. It wasn't just a single decision to suppress the letter. It was a chain of decisions made by individuals in powerful positions who feared what might come next if the letter saw the light of day. And yet, despite this growing web of confirmation, the letter itself remained officially unverified. No public agency released it. No palace statement referenced it. It existed only in the shadows, in the voices of those who had seen it or touched its consequences. And for the public, that absence of transparency created a hunger, a thirst for resolution. That hunger led journalists, amateur sleuths, and legal analysts to begin piecing together a timeline. They mapped out sightings, phone calls, courier deliveries. They charted the days between Philip's death and the supposed meltdown in Montecito. They tracked the odd movements of lawyers, the gaps in Meghan and Harry's schedule, the sudden shifts in royal protocol. And when placed side by side, the puzzle began to make sense. There was a letter. It was real. It was read. It was hidden. And when it finally slipped into the hands of the very woman it targeted, it caused precisely the chaos Philip had predicted. What makes these witness testimonies so powerful isn't just their consistency. It's the fact that none of them sought attention. They weren't giving televised interviews or writing memoirs. They weren't trying to sell books or become influencers. They spoke because they felt something sacred had been violated, because they believed the truth mattered more than silence, and because they understood that history, even royal history, cannot be rewritten by pretending inconvenient facts don't exist. Each voice added clarity to a murky story. Each account lifted the veil a little higher, and together, they brought the ghost of Philip's letter into the light. When the first whispers of a possible royal letter began circulating online, they were quickly dismissed by the mainstream press. A few fringe blogs speculated about a secret document penned by Prince Philip, but there was no confirmation, no evidence, just a series of vague hints and unnamed sources. In an age of information overload, it was easy to dismiss the story as fiction. But everything changed on a quiet Wednesday morning when a scan of the letter surfaced on an encrypted whistleblower forum known for leaking political and celebrity documents. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A single sheet of heavy parchment, slightly yellowed, with the royal crest pressed into the top left corner. The handwriting was neat, precise, unmistakably formal. There was no signature image, only a typed note at the bottom indicating it had been signed personally by Philip and delivered to the Lord Chamberlain following a closed-door meeting. The forum post came with a caption, "For those still pretending this didn't happen." The internet erupted. The skin spread like wildfire, first through anonymous Twitter accounts and Reddit threads, then into private Facebook groups and TikTok conspiracy channels. Before noon, it had made its way into the inboxes of several royal reporters, some of whom had already heard rumors about the letter but were too cautious to publish without proof. Now, the proof was in their hands, and it was damning. The letter didn't include flowery language or dramatic statements. It was direct, methodical, even clinical. It referenced a series of dates tied to the pregnancies and births of Archie and Lilibet. It listed meetings with royal staff and noted concerns raised by legal advisors regarding missing medical documentation and inconsistencies in registration. The tone was unmistakably legal, not emotional, and that made it more powerful. Most shocking of all was the final paragraph, in which Philip stated that until proper verification of lineage could be secured, neither child should hold or be recognized with royal titles, privileges, or succession status. He used the phrase revocation of assumption, suggesting that any previously assigned titles had been premature and should be considered null until further notice. That phrase echoed across social media, quoted and repeated with disbelief and outrage. Revocation of assumption. It wasn't just a denial. It was a reversal, a formal stripping away of royal status. The palace remained silent. In the absence of a response, the public filled in the blanks. Commentators took to television studios and live streams. Legal experts debated whether Philip's letter had legal force under royal constitutional law. Royal historians dug into archival materials, comparing the language in the letter with known documents used to govern succession in the past. They found troubling similarities. Suddenly, a question that had been circulating quietly in royal circles exploded into public discourse. Were Archie and Lilibet ever truly royal? Social media turned into a battleground. Supporters of Meghan and Harry cried foul, calling the letter an act of racial discrimination, a last gasp of a fading monarchy desperate to exclude. Others pointed to the facts, the documentation issues, the secrecy, the timing as evidence that something had always been off. Hashtags like #PhilipLetter, #RoyalRevocation, and #GhostHairs began trending globally. News outlets were split. Some cautiously reported on the leak, choosing to summarize rather than republish the letter itself. Others went all in, printing full excerpts, conducting interviews with analysts, and replaying old clips of Meghan and Harry's interviews to hunt for contradictions or clues. Talk shows lit up with speculation. Was this the real reason Harry and Meghan left the royal family? Had they known this letter was coming? Inside Buckingham Palace, the crisis deepened. Sources later revealed that the Queen was informed of the leak during her morning briefing. She reportedly said nothing for several minutes, simply staring at the single sheet of paper in front of her. Then she gave a simple instruction. There would be no public statement. The Crown would not dignify the leak with acknowledgement. But behind the scenes, the damage control operation kicked into full gear. Charles, meanwhile, was furious, not necessarily at the contents of the letter, which he already knew, but at the breach. How had something so sensitive been leaked to the public? How had they not seen it coming? Meetings were called. Phones were checked. An internal audit of staff communications was launched to identify the source of the leak. At the same time, pressure mounted on Harry and Meghan. Their representatives refused to comment. Meghan's spokesperson issued a one-line response when asked if the letter was real. "We do not respond to disinformation." But she didn't deny it. Not once. And that silence spoke volumes. Then came the footage. 3 days after the leak, a paparazzi video surfaced showing Meghan and Harry arriving at their Montecito estate, both looking visibly distressed. Meghan was seen covering her face, and Harry avoided the cameras entirely. The footage was short, only 22 seconds, but it fueled even more speculation. Was this the moment they found out the letter had been leaked? Was this the moment their silent strategy fell apart? Behind closed doors, the fallout was immediate. According to insiders, Meghan initiated a flurry of legal consultations, both in the United States and in the UK. There was concern that the letter could be used as evidence in future litigation regarding royal privileges or inheritance. Meanwhile, Harry reportedly reached out to several royal relatives, including Princess Eugenie and Lady Louise, seeking their perspective. Neither responded. What made the public unveiling so damaging wasn't just the content of the letter, it was the implication that the royal family had actively tried to suppress it. That, even after the death of one of their most senior members, they had chosen secrecy over transparency. The monarchy, already strained by public skepticism and generational change, now faced the most fundamental question of all. What is a royal title truly worth? Commentators on both sides began dissecting the meaning of royal identity in the modern world. If a title could be revoked by a single letter, was it truly hereditary? If Meghan and Harry's children could be excluded for administrative reasons, who else could be next? The pressure on the palace became unbearable. For weeks, every official appearance by a royal family member was met with shouted questions from reporters. Every online post, every speech, every photo op was flooded with comments demanding answers. The royal Instagram and Twitter accounts were inundated with posts reading simply, "What about the letter?" Still, the monarchy stayed silent. Then came the unexpected twist. An unnamed source from within the Queen's legal team began leaking additional documents, internal memos, notes from meetings, and email correspondences dating back to early 2021. These documents confirmed that the letter had not only been read, but discussed extensively behind closed doors. They revealed that palace lawyers had drafted at least two potential responses, one affirming Philip's concerns and another rejecting them outright. Neither was ever released. This second wave of leaks shattered any remaining illusion that the palace had been caught off guard. They had known, they had planned, and they had chosen to bury it. Now, with the truth exposed, the debate shifted from the authenticity of the letter to the morality of the cover-up. Was it right for the palace to hide such a critical document from the public? Was it fair to Meghan and Harry? Or had the crown simply tried to protect itself from the fire it knew was coming? Public opinion was split. Some saw the letter as a last attempt by an aging man to preserve a rigid institution, no matter the cost. Others saw it as a necessary act of stewardship, Philip doing what no one else had the courage to do. Still others believed the truth lay somewhere in between, lost in the layers of protocol, fear, and unresolved family conflict. But one thing was undeniable: the letter had changed everything. It had ripped the curtain away from the most protected institution in the world. It had forced the royal family to confront not just their image, but their own rules. And in doing so, it had sparked a reckoning not just about titles, but about truth. Every monarchy survives on tradition. From the precise way a tea is served to the moment a crown is placed on a head, centuries of etiquette and order define how the royal family operates. These rituals aren't just formalities. They are the very tools by which the institution preserves its legitimacy. Rules of succession, laws of title inheritance, and strict guidelines on conduct keep the image of the monarchy intact, generation after generation. But Prince Philip's letter, and the controversy it unleashed, didn't just disrupt the image. It shattered the system from within. The royal protocols regarding titles and succession are not arbitrary. They are governed by laws, some dating back to the early 1700s. The most prominent among them is the letters patent issued by King George V in 1917, which limits the use of the titles prince and princess to the children and grandchildren of the monarch. Under those rules, Archie and Lilibet, as great-grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth II, were not automatically entitled to those titles at birth. However, when Charles ascended the throne, they became eligible. Still, it had been understood by most that Meghan and Harry's children would receive courtesy titles or some kind of special consideration, especially given the monarchy's efforts to appear more inclusive and modern. And yet, the moment the letter surfaced, it became clear that the royal household had already been working under a different understanding. According to internal discussions leaked by anonymous staff, the letter had been quietly used to halt further planning around the children's formal status. No announcements were made. No updates to the official royal website were posted. Behind the scenes, they simply stopped the process. It was as if the children had been erased from the royal protocol roadmap. This deviation from established practice was unheard of. It wasn't just the titles themselves that were affected. Royal christenings typically involve a specific ritual: the Archbishop of Canterbury, the use of the lily font, and water from the River Jordan. It's not just ceremonial, it's a recognition of a royal child's place in the historical and spiritual order of the monarchy. Neither Archie nor Lilibet received this official ceremony under the Church of England's supervision. And that alone, insiders now say, was the first sign something had changed. What followed was a ripple effect across departments that handle royal duties. Security assignments for the children were revised. There were no plans for them to appear on the royal balcony at future Trooping the Color ceremonies. They were quietly removed from internal planning meetings regarding family public appearances. According to one security officer, they were never even issued internal ID codes that are standard for minor royals traveling with protection officers. This was more than an administrative oversight, it was a strategic distancing. These actions, though largely unseen by the public, signaled a fundamental break from protocol. If Archie and Lilibet were being denied the traditional elements of royal life, then their status as recognized royals was effectively revoked long before the public even heard about the letter. Prince Philip's words had been taken seriously, not debated, not challenged, simply acted upon. This raised serious questions among royal advisors and legal experts alike. Could a private letter, albeit from a senior royal, override existing law or royal tradition? The answer was complex. While Prince Philip did not have legislative power, his position as the consort of the monarch gave him access to the Queen's ear and a lifetime of influence over institutional decisions. He wasn't just a figurehead. He was a strategist. His letter may not have been law, but it was taken as a directive, one that those in charge felt compelled to obey in the absence of objection from the Queen or her heir. And there was no objection. That silence gave the letter power. What this created was an unprecedented situation, a quiet protocol shift that stripped royal privileges from children without any official decree or public statement. This went against every historical precedent. Even during the most controversial times in royal history, when Edward VIII abdicated or when Princess Diana's HRH status was removed, decisions were made through formal announcements. Transparency, even in disgrace, was the standard. But this was silence disguised as governance. Many in the public began asking, if the royal family could revoke the privileges of Archie and Lilibet without explanation, what else could they do without notice? Were other protocols subject to such private interference? Was the monarchy still bound by law, or had it become a matter of personal interpretation? Even members of parliament began to raise eyebrows. Though the monarchy is symbolic in many ways, its decisions affect public resources, including the cost of royal protection and ceremonial planning. When those decisions are made in secret, without parliamentary review or public notice, questions about accountability inevitably arise. To make matters even more complicated, the ripple effect of these broken protocols extended to international diplomacy. Foreign leaders were unsure how to refer to the children in official documents. International media outlets, once labeling Archie and Lilibet as prince and princess, suddenly found themselves retracting titles or changing style guides to match the ambiguity. Royal commentators disagreed with each other, creating confusion in the public domain. The press office for Buckingham Palace offered no clarification. The children's names were not included in the royal family's official Christmas message that year. Their photos did not appear in the family gallery during the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. There was no explanation, no apology. Just absence, just removal. All of this culminated in a broader realization. Royal protocol was no longer absolute. It could be bent, rewritten, or quietly ignored based on private decisions and hidden documents. The letter wasn't just a scandal. It was a tectonic shift. Supporters of the monarchy defended the move. They argued that the crown had the right to protect itself from potential manipulation or uncertainty. That titles were not entitlements, but privileges granted by the sovereign's will. Critics, however, warned that such discretion opened the door to abuse and inconsistency. If the rules could change for Meghan and Harry's children, what precedent did that set for future generations? The very idea of protocol is rooted in clarity. And yet, the letter had thrown the monarchy into a fog of ambiguity. The firm lines that once separated royal from non-royal had blurred, and with them, the public's trust in the system. When rumors first began to circulate that Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor might not be who the world believed he was, many dismissed the idea as the product of internet conspiracy theorists and royal-obsessed bloggers. But as time passed, and more pieces of the puzzle began to slip through the cracks, those whispers turned into something more. Not certainty, but suspicion. And at the heart of it all was a single, chilling question. What if the child at the center of one of the world's most famous families had never been fully seen by the very institution he was born into? It started with small inconsistencies. Royal births are, by design, public affairs, not in the intrusive sense, but in the ceremonial. Photos on the hospital steps. A royal aide placing a notice on the palace gates. The formal announcement through official channels. And soon after, a christening attended by senior royals, with approved media allowed limited access. But none of these things happened with Archie in the usual way. His birth was announced through Instagram. No formal public appearance. No step photo. No footage of a smiling Meghan and Harry walking out of a hospital with their newborn. And when the christening took place, it was behind closed doors with no public record of who attended or what occurred inside. That alone was enough to raise eyebrows. Then came the photos, or, more accurately, the lack of them. When images of Archie did surface, they were often tightly controlled, professionally staged, and released through Meghan and Harry's preferred media partners. Many of these photos were from angles that obscured his face. Some were from behind. Others showed only a hand or foot. To some, this was merely the couple exercising their right to privacy. To others, it was the first indication that something was amiss. As the months passed, Meghan and Harry relocated to the United States. Paparazzi in Los Angeles and later in Montecito, where the couple settled, were eager to capture candid images of the young family. Yet Archie was rarely, if ever, seen. There were no casual stroller walks caught on camera. No birthday parties snapped from afar. No blurry playground shots. For a family living in one of the most heavily photographed regions of the world, this was highly unusual. Then came the reports from staff. A former nanny, speaking anonymously to a British magazine, claimed she was hired through an agency to assist with newborn care at Frogmore Cottage, the Sussex's UK residence. She said she was dismissed after only a few days, never having seen a baby. Her tasks, she alleged, included preparing bottles, folding baby clothes, and maintaining the nursery, but she never fed, bathed, or held the child she was hired to care for. Another staff member, who worked as a housekeeper at the Montecito estate, later revealed to a reporter that she had seen what appeared to be a lifelike baby doll on multiple occasions. At first, she assumed it was a toy for Archie. But over time, she noticed that the same doll was moved between rooms and occasionally left in a car seat in the back of Meghan's vehicle. She admitted that she never saw a live child during her employment there. At this point, what had started as strange became unsettling. Theories began to take hold. Some suggested that Archie had indeed been born but was being kept out of public view due to medical complications. Others proposed something far darker, that the child was never born at all, and that the Sussexes had fabricated his existence to secure future royal benefits or maintain their brand's public image. These theories were bolstered when a whistleblower from a high-end toy manufacturer in California claimed their company had received a special custom order for a hyper-realistic doll designed to resemble a baby of mixed heritage. The order, made under a private name, was paid for in cash and came with a non-disclosure agreement. The company, known for producing lifelike infant dolls for film and television, refused to comment publicly. But perhaps the most disturbing moment came when a photo expert, hired by a media outlet to analyze publicly released images of Archie, pointed out digital inconsistencies. Shadows that didn't match lighting. Pixelation around the edges of his outline. In one image, the child's eyes appeared to be focused in two different directions. While the expert stopped short of calling the images doctored, he said that they had all the hallmarks of heavy manipulation. By now, the ghost kid theory had a name, and it was picking up traction. Royal historians and insiders began weighing in. One retired court official noted that during Queen Elizabeth's reign, no other royal child had received so little visibility, not even those intentionally kept from public view due to health conditions or security concerns. The lack of public documentation, combined with the refusal to allow royal staff to verify the child's presence, broke every established pattern. The most revealing moment may have come from within the palace itself. In late 2022, a leaked email from a senior member of the Queen's household revealed a line that many found haunting. As it stands, we have no independently confirmed visual of the child known as Archie Harrison. That phrase, no independently confirmed visual, sent shockwaves through royal watchers and journalists alike. If the palace itself had not verified Archie's presence, what did that mean? The question now was no longer whether Archie existed. It was whether the royal family believed he did. Meghan and Harry remained publicly silent about the mounting doubts. In interviews, they referred to their children in the present tense, discussed their parenting style, and shared anecdotes. But these stories were always light, always broad, always lacking the details that real parents often share. No stories about first words, favorite foods, or specific toys. Just general sentiments about wanting to give them privacy and normalcy. Meanwhile, Archie's absence became more conspicuous by the day. He did not attend family weddings. He did not appear in video calls with other royals during the pandemic. He was not seen during visits from friends or family. Even when the Queen passed away and Harry returned to London for funeral events, the children were reportedly left behind, again, with no verifiable record of their whereabouts. The theory became harder to ignore when it was linked to legal matters. A source within the Crown's legal advisory group confirmed that one of the documents attached to Prince Philip's letter was a request for formal verification of birth and lineage. It had allegedly been sent to the Sussexes through official channels and went unanswered. When a follow-up was issued, Meghan's legal team reportedly responded with a statement asserting that all necessary documents had been filed privately and no further inquiries were warranted. But without cooperation, the royal family had no way to confirm. This led to the term now used quietly in royal circles, ghost title. A title held by someone whose existence, though presumed,